Welcome everyone to the February meeting of the NWSOFA Fiscal and Economic Issues Group. Hey, I think I've got the screen. Hopefully you can all see it. So the goal here is to help everyone get the facts so you can use them in your discussions with your friends and neighbors and political opponents and all those kind of good folks. Through December, we had good economic news, solid but declining job growth, declining inflation rates for 6 straight months. And we actually got a second straight quarter of good GDP growth. After 3.2% in the third quarter, we got 2.9% in the fourth quarter. So all of that was good. And then last Friday, we got crazy jobs numbers, plus 517,000. And we'll go over all that and see if we can figure out what the heck that means. So we added 517,000 jobs in January after adding 260,000 in December. Also, a couple of things. Now, January, like every month, is seasonally adjusted. So that 517,000 is after seasonal adjustments. And the 2022, the other thing that happened in January was that they went back and compared unemployment tax returns, which have number of employees, to the data that was reported by companies throughout the year. And that change resulted in adding 813,000 jobs to the 2022 numbers, in addition to the 517,000 in January 2023, which means that jobs went up about 1.3 million versus the number of jobs that we would have reported in December, and a little more than that versus what we did report in December for November jobs. So we're at 155 million jobs, payroll jobs, record jobs level. This is 2.7 million more jobs than the pre-pandemic peak. I will say, we always, if you do look at not seasonally adjusted numbers, we always see a big drop off in jobs in January. This time the drop off was apparently not quite as big as we expected, as they expect in the seasonal adjustments. But we actually lost about 2 million jobs in January versus December, not counting seasonal adjustments. So that's a little bit of shade to put on the seasonally adjusted number. We talk about the 1.33 million more than the Bureau of Labor Statistics were originally reported in December. And here's where we can see that there were changes throughout the year in terms of jobs on a monthly basis. Some up, some down, but in general, a lot of them went up. And so we got that 813,000 additional jobs from the unemployment returns, and the 517,000 jobs gave us a really nice jobs number. If we look at the last 3 months as reported, they averaged 356,000. You see that we had been seeing a decline in jobs, which looked like heading towards a soft landing until the January number. The Fed perceived the slowing job creation as a positive because they felt that was consistent with slowing inflation. David put in here that about 190,000 jobs per month are required to keep unemployment rates stable, assuming the average monthly job growth, monthly labor force growth continues. Is the January number an anomaly? I haven't gone back and looked at the calendar to see whether the week that we used was really close to the beginning of the year and they hadn't yet had the beginning of the year layoffs, which could be the issue. But it could be a lot of things. And so we will have to take a look and see what happens over the next few months. The unemployment rate, like the big jobs numbers, was shockingly good at 3.4%. It got down to 3.5% during the Trump administration for a while, right, pre-COVID. But it hadn't been to 3.4% since 1969. U6 rate actually went up a little bit in January to 6.6%, but that's still a very low rate. And for those of you, if you haven't seen this, the U3 rate is the unemployment rate that's typically reported, and it's people who are not working and have looked for a job in the prior 4 weeks. The U6 rate is people who are not working and have looked for a job anytime in the prior year, plus people who are working part-time jobs who want full-time jobs. So that's why the U6 rate is always going to be higher than the U3 rate. And from the household survey, we were just looking at data from the payroll jobs numbers are from the establishment survey. The household survey is where they call up 50 or 60,000 households. And they had a big adjustment in January, which added about a million people to the population. The civilian labor force went up a lot. I think that's a labor force participation rate on the new folks of about 77% versus the 62 that was in there. And actually the employment to population ratio is actually a little higher than that. It's closer to 79% for this, million people that got added to the population. And even with the big growth in the population, the number of unemployed went down. People in the labor force that were not working. But we also added about 250,000 people who are not in the labor force. The last data was for everybody 16 and above. We like to look at the prime age workforce, people 25 to 54, which takes out people, mostly takes out students under 25 and retirees over 54. So it's leaves out some of the distortions caused by those groups. What we see is that it peaked at 80.5% prior to the pandemic and is back up to 80.2%. Getting there, but not fully recovered. Why isn't it fully recovered? Well, a lot of it seems to be COVID related. We had some prime age fatalities, but a big thing is folks that have long COVID and are not working due to their own illness, injury, or medical problems. So that's a big part of why that employment to population ratio for prime age workers is not yet fully recovered.
Carl, can I ask a question about that last slide?
Sure.
There are 500,000 folks that are out. Is that like a permanent disability? Is it a medical disability? Are they on unemployment? Are they being paid? What is their status?
This is self-reported that when they answered the phone, they weren't at work due to their own illness, injury. It is not a function of unemployment claims. It is not a function of disability claims.
All right, now, and then that 129 prime age facilities. So that means about 1 million people died that were older or not prime, right?
Right.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
So there were mostly 55 and older. There were a few that were under age 25 that died. This is December. We have a lot of job openings. We have almost 2 job openings for everyone who's unemployed. So it should be relatively easy to find a job, although perhaps not the high income jobs that you were getting at Facebook and Google and all of those companies that were paying really high salaries. The tech workers are having to accept slightly less lucrative employment. And projections of fastest growing jobs, and this is KPMG, and this is fastest growing by percent. You'll see that some of these are really small numbers of workers, like motion picture projectionists, and they're not terribly high paid. This is from May 2021. So if you want a fast growing job, it's got a fair number of jobs and a decent pay, nurse practitioner seems to be the way to go. Data scientists, reasonable number of jobs, a lot of cooks and restaurant workers, but not real high paid. And information security analysts, a reasonable number of jobs being created and a decent salary along with statisticians. Okay. And this may just be the result of a PowerPoint presentation being shared in Google Slides. As you see the odd shading in the lower left. But it's, again, what we're talking about, record number of people working. And I think that's actually record. Now I'd have to go back and look. I think that's actually record number of payroll jobs. It's also a record number of people working. We've added 12.1 million jobs since Biden was inaugurated, or since January of 2021. And real wages are higher than they were pre-pandemic in 2019. So overall, pretty good. Let me glance at the chat and see. Joe says he used to be a high-paid umpire 40 years ago. And Bill commented, if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask, in case I missed your point in the chat. Do feel free to speak up and we will handle questions as best we can. GDP scared a lot of people in the first half of last year.
Hold up. You said something about nurses something, right?
Nurse practitioners.
What is it? What do you mean? Is that the best job to get in an economy?
Well, what it says is that KPMG, the accounting consulting firm, says that there's going to be a big increase in the number of nurse practitioners, percent increase versus the number there are right now. It's a relatively new field. I'm not sure how many years nurse practitioners have been around, but I'm fairly certain it's mostly less than 2 decades. And so as more people enter the field, we're going to have a big increase in the number of nurse practitioners, almost 50% growth over the next 10 years, or the 10 years from 2021 to 2031. You see the number of people being added as 112,000. So that's a pretty good job growth. And the salary, the median salary back in 2021 was 121,000. Also, not a bad number for most people, well above the median salary overall.
You can continue now.
Okay. So what you see is that real GDP is back at a record number. We had a pre-pandemic peak of 19.22 trillion, real inflation adjusted number, versus current of 2020. We saw that we had 2 quarters of very slight decrease in real GDP, and we've had 2 more quarters of growth. We had growth of 3.2% in the third quarter, and then 2.9% real growth on an annualized basis in the fourth quarter. Bureau of Economic Analysis does annual growth numbers. by taking the average of the 4 quarters and the average of these 4 quarters, look at it. They say we had 2.1% annual growth. If you look at fourth quarter versus fourth quarter, the economy grew 1% in 2021. I mean, I'm sorry, in 2022. Although technically it's probably better to look at it once we get the first quarter of 2023. That's a bit better, more closer to a calendar year growth rate. But I don't expect to be much larger than the 1%. And we see that the average growth rate under Biden since he took office in the first quarter of 21 through the end of 2022 is 2.9%, which is pretty good when you compare to other presidents, especially other recent presidents. These are the average growth rates of real GDP by president, and we see that Trump basically, Biden beats all the recent presidents except Clinton. The ones that are higher: Kennedy, Johnson, Clinton, Reagan, Carter, and Ford. But will he be able to maintain the 2.9%? Probably not. Part of that is the recovery from the big COVID recession. And so I expect this number to come down, but where it ends up, we'll have to see what happens over the next couple of years. Okay, the components of real GDP in the fourth quarter, or actually the 2022 growth. And so service consumption grew and everything else sort of balanced out is what the notes here say. And the feeling is that that may or may not continue to have decent growth going forward. And David, feel free to add your comments anytime you want to speak up. Per capita GDP is again at a record level in the fourth quarter. And these are inflation adjusted numbers. So that's good. The only thing to remember about these is that these are averages. And as I always used to say 10 years ago, you, me, and Bill Gates have an average net worth in the tens of billions of dollars. But that doesn't necessarily reflect me or you. And so I'm a little leery of the averages like this because they are up by, raised a lot by the top 1%, the top 10%. Productivity, real GDP per worker, again, higher than 2019. We had briefly early on in the recession, we see that surprisingly, counterintuitively, this number shot up. And why that is because we laid off a bunch of low-income workers. And so the average worker had higher wages and higher productivity. And the waitresses were not working because the restaurants were mostly closed.
Carl, question for you.
Sure.
Is the GDP, how does that relate to the wages? So these are not the average wages or the median wages. This is the GDP of the country divided by the working, the employed folks.
Yeah, the number of workers. Now, obviously, when we had the workforce drop by over 20 million people during this time frame, and GDP didn't drop by quite as much, that's when you had, high GDP per worker, increase in GDP per worker. And as workers have come back online, it's come back down. But we seem to be settling in at a level that's above the pre-pandemic level.
There has been a fair amount of media noise around this productivity as falling, and you can see in that chart, if Carl goes back one for a second, they're just using that last year, saying productivity is falling, and not giving you any context. The Washington Post did a big one on it, and a few others have been talking about it. Productivity is just fine. And CEOs are also using that data to say we got to get our employees back into the office. But the fact is productivity is way up. And if you take this distortion out, it's fine. So don't let that bad news get to you. They're just taking that last sort of middle of 2021 and comparing that to where we are now, and they're saying it's dropping. Well, yeah, that's true. But why is it dropping? They're acting like it's a big mystery, which is making me laugh. I'm like, well, it's obvious why it's happening. One of the things they do sometimes, they don't use these raw numbers that I'm using here. They're not using the real GDP and the number of employees. They have other ways of computing productivity. This sort of takes all that noise out. Just says what's really happening, adjusted for inflation, number of workers, and all is good. So don't let that bad news get to you that you'll hear on, we've got a productivity issue. Not really.
Yeah. Of course, just as a side note, if we work to get everybody driving back into the office, we'll increase the demand for gas, raise the gas price, and raise inflation. Good plan, CEOs. Anyhow, one of the concerns last year was we had 2 consecutive quarters of slightly negative real GDP growth. Therefore, we were in a recession. Not really, that's not how it's defined, but that's a back of the envelope definition that some people use. The National Bureau of Economic Research has 6 indicators that they look at, and you see that in the first half of the year, 2 of them were down, 4 of them were up. And in the second half of the year, pretty much all of them were up versus the beginning of the year, which says that, we are not in a recession. I don't think that the National Bureau of Economic Research will go back and say we were in a recession anytime in 2022. But that doesn't mean we won't be in a recession at some point going forward. A lot of things could happen. The Fed could keep raising interest rates and force a recession, or the Republican House members could refuse to raise the debt ceiling and cause a recession. So a recession, may well occur, but we'll see how that works out. Probability of recession based on interest rate comparisons went way up to 47%. I don't know, I look at the jobs numbers for January and go, yeah, maybe not. And actually, this is saying that they think we may get a 47% chance of recession by December 2023. Is that how I'm reading this, David?
Yes, a year out.
Okay, but it probably didn't include the jobs numbers for January of 2023, which would tend to argue that maybe we won't see one at least in the first half of the year.
That's right. I mean, if you don't, realistically, unless unemployment gets above 4%, it's going to be really hard to say that there was a peak. And when you think that what the NBER does is they call economic cycles, meaning the start of a recession is when the economy peaked. And so right now it's really hard to say that the economy has peaked because, as Carl was saying, all those things are showing growth and GDP is growing and is at a record level. So to say we've hit a peak is rather difficult to argue. They could look at the GDP numbers and say we had a peak in the fourth quarter of 2021 and call a recession. I don't think they're going to do that. Also, you don't usually see a recession when the unemployment rate is falling, which it's been doing consistently during the Biden administration. I think before you would even bother to talk about are we in a recession, you'd have to see the unemployment rate above 4. I think that's sort of the red line you cross to say, okay, we may have definitely hit a peak. because the unemployment rate is above 4, and I would not just look for one measure of that. I would wait, see 2 or 3 months of above 4% unemployment. Then you could probably say we hit a peak right around now. And you think about it this way: is understand a recession doesn't have to be a bad recession, right? It can be a very mild recession that we get out of quickly. There's nothing that says we can't get out of a recession fast. The unemployment rate of 3.4%, we haven't seen that since 1969. And I think there was an article in the Washington Post that said to see a 3.3 unemployment rate, you have to go even back further. You have to go back like another 20 years or something. It was a long time. You have to go back further to see 3.3. It's pretty hard to beat that, right? I mean, how are you going to beat 50-something, 70-something year low unemployment? And so it's of course, you kind of say, well, of course we're going to have a recession because there's almost no way we're going to beat where we are now. How do you beat 3.4% unemployment? It's almost impossible. So you would think that we will hit a peak soon and it will turn into, we will be off that peak, but who knows when exactly that's going to happen and when NBER is going to call it. And I would just say, if you're in an argument with somebody about we're in a recession or blah, 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 unless you see that unemployment rate go above 4, don't think we're in a recession. I don't think anybody's going to call a recession if the unemployment rate goes back to 3.7, 3.8 for a while. It's going to have to get into that 4 range and stay there for a bit before you could comfortably say we peaked and now we're in recession. And it might be, think of it this way too. Historically, the unemployment rate, historical average is 5.8%. So the unemployment rate is extremely low. If we say we have a peak and the unemployment rate is bumping around in the 4s, we're still well below the historical average unemployment rate, and then we'd be technically in a recession. So if it takes a 4% something unemployment rate to put inflation to bed, that's the trade-off the Fed is trying to decide if it's worth it. And each of us has their own value judgment on that. I don't think it's worth it, but that's what they're trying to decide. And right now, you're just not in a recession when the unemployment rate is at 3.4% and dropping. You've got to see it turn, convincingly.
I would focus a little less on the unemployment rate, and you'll see the second and third variables on this graphic are employment. Payroll employees is the second line, and household survey employment levels are the third line. As long as employment is going up, I don't think we're going to see a recession. It's when employment starts to drop then I start worrying about a recession. So if employment starts dropping for a period of time, that's a problem. I mean, we could have a huge amount of immigration that causes our labor force to grow up and grow significantly, and they don't all get jobs, and the unemployment rate goes up. And that's not a recession if employment keeps growing and real GDP keeps growing because immigration went up. So,
and to Carl's point, notice he's right in that. Do you see the unemployment rate on this chart? The answer is no. You don't. There's something out there called the SOM rule, which is that you look at the unemployment rate having basically bumping up 0.5% from its low, which would get you into the 4s. That's where you tend to see that a recession starts. But Carl's exactly right, and then you have to see downturns in these measures before the NBER is going to call a recession, and the jobs and the employment are two of the key ones.
Yeah, to me, I think those are the biggest things that the National Bureau of Economic Research looks at. Now, employment tends to be a slightly lagging indicator. If you go back to the Great Recession from December 2007 to June 2009, what you see is that the jobs numbers started to fall in February of 2008, 2 months after the official start of the recession. And I used the example of my then roommate who worked in hotel management, front desk staff. Initially, he was, they cut back his hours and his shifts when their business dropped off. It was later that they let him go, and it took him a while to find a job again. Although now he's doing great as general manager of hotels down in Texas, so he's doing okay. We a little early for taking a break. Shall we dive right into budget deficits?
Carl, there's some questions in the chat you may want to answer first.
Okay, let me find the chat. I commented about the umpire. How do jobs compare to 2019? I think that was answered as we're about 2 million higher. And the nurse practitioner, I don't really think it's pandemic stresses. Those nurses that are quitting are probably not becoming nurse practitioners. At least my knowledge. Because it does take a substantial amount of additional schooling to become a nurse practitioner. I have a niece that's just starting out in that program. She's a freshman at Penn State.
And regarding that question on the 2019, the chart that we showed, it's on page 4, that February 2020 peak is higher than 2019, meaning that was the pre-pandemic peak. If we extended that chart back further, those numbers in 2019 would be lower. So, and Biden is 2.7 million jobs above that pre-pandemic peak. And he's been in office for 24 months or so. So one thing Republicans like to argue is that Biden should only get credit for jobs once we had fully recovered. That's not how the scorecard works, but that's what they like to argue. So they only want to give him credit for that 2.7 million jobs. If you were to go along that line of argument, Biden's been in office 24 months. So you're looking at a little bit over 100,000 jobs created per month if you use that standard. One thing that mattered here, if you were to look at our chart from last month, from the last meeting, from the December level, we're this 1.3 million jobs higher than was initially reported. So you would see like a 153.7 or something million jobs in our prior one, but with these adjustments now we're at 155. So that we added it would have been, that 2.7 million got a bump of 1.3 million since last meeting. That's a huge jump. So Biden still, if you use the Republican standard of fully recovering, going from there, then yeah, you have slower job creation of 100 something a month, but that's not how it's done. If you want to blame people for what the administration before has done, then what you would also be doing is massively increasing the number of jobs that Obama, you wouldn't, if you're using the Republican standard, you'd also penalize Obama a lot because the jobs were falling through the floor when he took over, and took almost 5 years, I think, till 2014 for those jobs to regain their pre-pandemic peak. So it's a way of severely punishing the Democrats for Republican malfeasance. And that's not how it's done. We just use the start of when each president starts in office. We use that January period as period 0, and then we go forward from there, and we use that for all the presidents consistently when we evaluate them. For people that are new, we have a separate presentation we do from time to time that explains why the economy does so much better under Democrats, and it shows that job creation is about 2.5 times faster under Democrats by that measure. So you'll hear that. I wouldn't assign it any weight. The Democrats, as usual, are the cleanup crew. And you've heard us say it before, those of you that have been here, 10 of the last 11 recessions started under Republican presidents. And Carl, you want to say your favorite little saying before I shut up and let you go to the budget section?
Oh, do you mean the last Republican president who did not have a recession start on his watch was James Garfield, who served 6 months in 1881 before he died from an assassin's bullet? Every other Republican president had a recession start on his watch.
That's the one.
Had a question for Kerry. He said that nurse practitioners are cheaper than doctors. I know salary wise they are for a a medical service. Since all of my medical bills are paid through insurance of one form or another, I don't see a difference in what I'm billed when I see a nurse practitioner versus an MD. Does anybody else see a difference in that?
That's the point. The hospitals save money. They make as much money off of you, but they pay less in salaries, so they're making a bigger profit. That's the whole point.
Okay. Because hospitals are, drowning in profit. And what do I think President Biden will say about the economy in tomorrow's State of the Union?
Businesses are never drowning in profit. They always want more.
I mean, I think that he'll talk about the 12 million jobs that have been created since he took office, or that have been added since he took office, the 5 million jobs in the last year, and the various bills that were passed. If he was smart, he'd probably go back and take a look at how many jobs were being added in the 3 months before he took office, because that's a really low number. I think I haven't gone back to see how it got restated in the most recent revisions, but memory is that we actually had negative job growth in December 2020.
Yeah, and I think he'll focus on the labor market primarily in it, because that's where the main strength is in the economy, and just talk up a few points on that one. And then, as you guys said, then he can talk about the legislation that has been passed. It's just some of that legislation is difficult to translate, so it'll be interesting to see how they do that. Like, for example, he can't really say that the IRA has reduced inflation significantly, but he can point out some really good things that are in there and make it relatable for people. For example, it's difficult to explain the giant relief act, but you can say, I put a $1,200 check into each of your pockets. He can do it that way, and I hope that his team is communicating it in that way, in very tangible, bite-sized chunks that people can understand, and not, legislative jargon. And I think his crew's is fairly good at that. So I think he'll be all right. I think he's got a lot of good news, and you're going to hear us go through it all tonight by the end. But he's got he should be pumping up the economy big time. He's got great news that he can share. And even when we'll get into the inflation and wages section, real wages are up versus 2019. They're better. You have more purchasing power than you had under Trump, despite inflation on average. And he should make that point as well.
I mean, the one thing that will be different is I say we've added 12 million jobs under President Biden. He may say we have added 12 million jobs and take personal credit for it, as opposed to the United States. It'll be interesting to see how he handles that. So we've got deficit numbers that were relatively low at the end of the Obama administration. 2017 was actually forecast to go down a little bit when he left office, but revenue was slow coming in, so it went up a little bit. With the tax cuts and spending increases, the deficits continue to go up in the fiscal years 2018, 2019. Again, fiscal years run from October 1st to September 30th. So fiscal year 2017 was an Obama budget year because we were 4 months into the fiscal year when President Trump took office. So we see, and then with the pandemic, huge bumps in budget deficits and what was signed into law by President Trump. And then, although American Rescue Plan is actually in this fiscal year 2021, when Trump left office, this was forecast to be, I think, a 2.2 or $2.3 trillion deficit, and it came in at 2.8. And then we see that in Biden's first budget year, the budget deficit dropped from 2.8 to 1.4, and it's projected to drop for a couple of years. And then what we see is that with the aging population, Social Security, Medicare, Senior Citizen Medicaid, it's expected that the deficit will go up under current law. So that's the trend. And now we're going to dive into fiscal year 2022. The American Rescue Plan helped put a lot more people back to work. We've seen that on the jobs numbers, which meant revenue increased by 850 billion versus what we had in fiscal year 2021. Spending decreased by almost $1 trillion, except that the budget folks said that the 425 billion of student loan forgiveness announced in August gets counted as spending. So a net of 550 billion of spending decrease in fiscal year 2022. Now this has partially taken place from the deferral of student loans, but there has not been the sort of forgiveness that was called for when President Biden announced it in August. And as a betting person, I'm guessing that the Supreme Court will not allow that student loan forgiveness to go forward, primarily because the relatively weak reason for it that gave him the authority was the pandemic, which is going to be officially over before the Supreme Court decides the case. That's my speculation. And that's all it is, a speculation.
Now, one thing about this, if you use that 950 billion number, which I think is more accurate now since the student loans were not forgiven in fiscal 2022, we'll see how CBO wants to handle it. Even if they are forgiven, it may be a 2023 item when they adjust. But that 3.8% of GDP is way below, and I'm looking in the gray box, the 950 billion is just a little bit below the 2019 budget deficit under Trump. The 3.8% of GDP is much lower than the 2019 deficit. And I don't want to, we'll get into this in probably not next month, but the month after. We'll have all the information we need. It'll be worth going through it. But when we talk about these sector balances and this idea that a budget deficit should be bigger than your trade deficit, the trade deficit is somewhere around 3% of GDP. So if we could maintain a 3.8% of GDP budget deficit, that's pretty much right where you want it. That is a Goldilocks scenario for your budget deficit, just a little bit larger than your trade deficit over the long run. Now, Carl showed the chart on the prior page that has the deficit as a percent of GDP, that black line climbing as the country ages. So that's going to get to budget deficits that are a little bit more than that 3% of GDP, and we'll have to deal with that there. But realistically, when Republicans are talking about we want to cut government spending, you got Social Security, you got Medicare, you got defense. Our federal government is the saying goes, what is the saying? We're a pension and healthcare company with an army. You've got those three things, you got to cut one of them. And if the Republicans aren't going to cut Medicare, Social Security, or defense, then they're not really talking seriously making changes in the budget. They're clearly not going to talk about raising taxes on the rich and reversing the Trump tax cuts for corporations. So they're just talking. They're not really serious about dealing with budget deficits. And as we pointed out earlier, budget deficits are a lot lower under Democrats historically anyway. We are the party that can claim fiscal responsibility, not the Republicans. I think part of their strategy with the debt ceiling, and we'll get into that probably next month in more detail, is that they're just talking about it just to sort of make it seem like they care about spending reduction and balancing the budget, but Democrats do it better. And I hope Biden says that. He will definitely talk about how much the budget deficit's been reduced. It'll be interesting to hear if he says, historically, we Democrats run much lower budget deficits than Republicans. I would love to hear a president of the United States say that. And I don't think he will, but it would be awesome if he did, because people need to start hearing that. Republicans always poll better on the economy, and they shouldn't.
Just a note, these numbers come from a CBO report from last May. Other than the actual budget deficit in fiscal year 2022. And they're going to release their revised forecast in a couple of weeks on February 15th. So I'm looking forward to that release, and
Yeah.
we'll be updating our numbers next month to reflect what the CBO is forecasting based upon current law.
If you read one thing in the entire year from the CBO, that is the report to read. And it's written for Congress. It's not written for economists. And the congressmen, you know the education and brain level we've got what they're dealing with, and they write for them. So this is a report that normal people can read. It's got lots of pictures. We'll share a bunch of them in our next presentation. But it's a great report, and it's something that you can read throughout the year and get wisdom from. It's fantastic. There is so much great information in there about what's going on in the world, and well, in the U.S. economy. They don't get into the international too much, other than some basic risk factors. But it's fantastic, and that's the one to look for. The other one being they do a great report on inequality as well every year. I actually prepared a bunch of slides on that for this session, but it was too long with GDP. So we're going to cover the inequality report probably, if not next month, then the one after that.
I will warn you that the CBO's budget and economic outlook updates are not short. The executive summaries are a decent read. I'm guessing that most Congress folks don't actually read the whole report or very much of it. I could be wrong, but so inflation helps reduce the debt to GDP ratio, which has actually fallen from the third quarter. Well, fallen from its peak, and looks like back in 2020, probably the second quarter of 2020, when it was almost 105% of GDP, down to about 95% of GDP in the third quarter of last year. So even though the debt was increasing, GDP was increasing faster, and therefore debt to GDP ratio has fallen for the last couple of years.
And just to be clear, you'll sometimes hear a version of this called, they use the national debt overall, which uses some other things that the government owes. The debt to GDP ratio we're using here is the debt held by the public, which is the part of the national debt that really matters. That's the Treasury securities that are outstanding. Those are the bonds that the government has issued. That doesn't include things like the Social Security Trust Fund and other stuff that's in the national debt. And so you use this number. CBO uses it as well in their analysis. So don't get hung up on when you see that the national debt of the United States is going up as a percent of GDP. This is the right metric to use.
Well, Joe, thanks for joining us, and hopefully you can join us next month. Interest rates, interest payments as a percent of GDP, we see they were quite high in the 80s, especially the early 90s, and then interest rates have fallen, and therefore interest payments as a percent of GDP went down, especially when we were running some surpluses back in the late 90s, early 2000s. But interest payments have started to go up because we've got a fair amount of debt, and interest rates have started to go up. So that's a concern going forward. If interest rates were to continue to go up a lot, this could be a problem. And now looks like a decent time to take a break before we talk about inflation and wages.